easier said than done. And sometimes young preachers in particular, not to pick on the young or the inexperienced necessarily, what they do is they tend to preach the commentary rather than preach a sermon. And what I mean by that is that they do all of the commentary work and they begin to put down every single piece of data that they could possibly accumulate about that particular text. And then they put it together into a sermon, which is really just another form of a commentary. And then as they begin to try to preach this to the congregation, what they've failed to do is to put it in some sort of a actual homiletical form so that they could convey that truth with power and clarity and conviction and sort of a natural kind of delivery. Now, Keith, just so you know, I'm looking out my window. I'm seeing a terrible thunderstorm rolling in right now with thunder and lightning, and my room is lighting up here. So if anything happens, buddy, and I get cut off here, you're going to have to just roll with what you got, and I'll try to reconnect as soon as I can. That's the danger of doing live stuff here, brother. But I'm not sure what the storm is going to do. But I do want to mention something about outlining here, because when we begin to try to take the text and put it into a homiletical form, you have to do something. You have to get it into some kind of a substructure. And typically what we're going to do is we're going to try to prepare an outline. Now, I'm a huge outlining advocate. Whenever I read complicated books, I'll often write outlines of them. It takes a lot more time, but it's still worth the doing. I learned that from one of my friends who's the smartest guy I know, John Marco at Cornerstone University. He outlines everything he reads, and it takes forever, but it's a good way to apprehend information. Same thing is true when you're trying to understand a text. I like to take the entire text, copy it and paste it, put it in a blank Word document, and I start toying with the text. And when I say toying with it, I don't mean that I'm monkeying with it in the sense that I'm adjusting its meaning, but rather I'm looking for substructures within that text. Very often, a biblical text will naturally form its own kinds of divisions. And typically when a preacher begins to make an outline that's suitable for homiletical delivery, he will choose some kind of an outline to convey that material. Sometimes it's a multi-point outline, such as a 7-point outline or an 8-point sermon. To me, these end up preaching a little bit more like a bullet point list and not necessarily like a smooth exposition of the text. Most commonly, a preacher will choose something like the 3-point sermon. And to this, I do think that there is quite a bit to commend. Keith, I actually preach quite a bit of 3-point sermons myself. There's just something very Presbyterian or Trinitarian about the idea of a threefold structure. But in doing 3-point sermons, one thing I want to identify is that the 3 points should cohere naturally together. In other words, you're not just taking any random 3 points and putting them together, because then you have sort of like a patchwork quilt of pictures from the text that don't really have anything to do with one another. So if you're going to use a threefold homiletical format, try to make sure that the 3 points that you're selecting actually go together thematically. So let me give you an example. I happen to be preaching in Romans chapter 8 right now, where Paul is addressing the concept of sonship. Okay, well, there's a lot there, and I could do a lot with sonship. But if I was going to divide that concept into 3 points, I might want to make all of those 3 points have to do with the same theme, which is being a child of God. So in this case, I could do a sermon like this. I could talk about that children of God bear the image of God. That could be point 1. Second point, that the Father has special affection for his children. And then the third point could be the inheritance that we have as children of God. Now, that's a perfect 3-point sermon, because each one of those 3 points actually support the main idea, which is that we are children of God. I would not want to do a 3-point sermon where I talk about circumcision was the sacraments of the Old Testament. Paul came from Tarsus, and therefore you must be born again. Those 3 things might all be true, but they have nothing to do with each other, even if we did find a text in which those 3 things could come together reasonably. It'd be a very disjointed, sort of a scattershot type of sermon. So if you're going to have a good 3-point sermon, again, those 3 points should cohere. If I was going to preach on the Lord's Supper, I might talk about the Lord's Supper in relation to our vertical relationship with God, our horizontal relationship with other people, and then internally what's happening in my heart as I prepare for the table. Again, that's a perfect 3-point sermon, because all 3 points actually support the main point, which is that we are communing with the Lord. So if you're going to use a 3-point structure, here's a good recommendation. It comes from one of my professors, John Frame. Now, if you've ever read anything from John Frame, he is famous for his so-called tri-perspectivalism, where he takes every concept, he breaks it down into 3 different perspectives. He calls them, technical terms coming, the normative, the situational, and the existential. Normative has to do with what we believe. The situational has to do with our actual lives, and the existential has to do with the heart. Okay. Now you could take those 3 concepts and preach brilliant 3-point sermons because the points will always cohere with the main thrust, right? So if you think about it like this, if you forget normative, situational, and existential, think about your 3 points as being something of the head. What must we know about this text? Something we must learn. The heart, which is what's going on inside the believer as he's hearing the sermon, and then the hands, what should we do about it? Now, if you structure your sermon in that kind of a way, you're going to have a really brilliant 3-point sermon, and it's all going to come together under the main heading of the basic theme of that particular text, which is another thing that I think a good outline does. In every good outline, there should be a thesis statement in which you are directly telling the people, as well as reminding yourself, what we are in fact doing here today. And often I'll tell my people as I'm preaching to them, this is my goal today. By the time I finish the sermon, I'm going to carry across this major theme. And then I articulate that theme in its various subpoints and so forth. Okay. Now, another way to do this, the 3-point sermon, would be what the Puritans used to do. And here I do think our friend Jonathan Edwards, this book that I'm recommending, reading through his sermons, will show you how Edwards approaches 3-point sermons. Actually, Edwards does 27-point sermons and 39-point sermons and 52-point sermons. They have a lot of points, but the structure is always the same. For Edwards, every single sermon is text, wherein he gives us the context of that particular passage, doctrine, wherein he tells us what the passage teaches as it relates to divine things, and then finally, application, which is the largest section of every Edwardian sermon. And we'll talk a little bit more about application towards the end, as I mentioned. The last thing I'd like to say, Keith, before I kick it back to you, is that not every sermon should be 3 points. Sometimes a text has a duality, which is to say a tension within it. And in those kind of sermons, a 2-point sermon will work better than a 3-point sermon. So let me give you a couple examples of a 2-point sermon. If you have a 2-point sermon where 2 things are being contrasted, let's say light and darkness, well, that'd be a great 2-point sermon. But your 2 points should usually be held in tension with one another. So if you're preaching Philippians 1:21, where Paul says to live is Christ and to die is gain, boom, there's your 2-point sermon right there. Don't try to stretch it into a third. Okay. Go with it. To live is Christ. Tell us everything you know about living as Christ. Then dying is gain. What does it mean by gain as it relates to the idea of Christian death? Okay. So perfect 2-point sermon. Those 2 points are in tension. Again, example from Romans 8. I happen to be in Romans 8 right now. Paul is talking about to live according to the flesh is death, but to live according to the Spirit is life and peace. Okay, paraphrase there. But you get the idea. We have 2 thoughts in tension, living according to the flesh, living according to the Spirit. These 2 things are in tension. Therefore, I have a very clear and obvious choice to do a 2-point sermon, perhaps with some applications at the end. Okay, so if you're going to go with 3, make sure they cohere, or use frames normative, situational, and existential. If you're going to do a 2-point sermon, make sure those 2 points are actually in tension with one another. Again, not 2 randomly chosen things like baptism is by pouring and I don't know, Paul is the author of Hebrews. Okay, those 2 things have nothing in common, let's say. So Keith, I'm wondering about you, brother, kicking it back over to you. When you preach your sermons, do you typically do multiple points, or do you just flow and just start talking about the text, or how do you approach your homiletical structure?
I tend to find myself using a 3-point structure, not because I necessarily have to, but it seems as if that has that I have a natural bent in that direction. And I think there is a certain rhetorical value in things coming in 3s. Oftentimes when we're listing things off, as you know, or we're saying things, it just seems to fit naturally into the mind of man. And perhaps that is Trinitarian in nature, the fact that we do think of things in 3s. And I appreciate Dr. Frame's perspectival view, because I think there is something to it. And so I don't try to force 3 points, but it's more often than not, it finds itself as 3 points. as I'm beginning to put together my homiletical structure. So I definitely would say I agree with that.
One more quick thing, Keith, and then I'll let you go. This sermon that I'm doing this Sunday happens to be a 5-point sermon. And this is a little bit much because 5 points are a lot to articulate and then try to apply. But as I looked at the text, that was the natural division of the text in my mind, because where I'm at in Romans right now, he's talking about the identity of a believer. And he talks about us as being brothers, as being debtors, as being adopted sons, then children of God. And then what's the last one? I'm blanking on the last one. There's 5 though. And it just seems to work. That's what the text suggests. So we got 5 points coming this Sunday.
Yeah. Yep. Well, that moves right into what I'm going to be talking about next. And that is the idea of how we actually take that outline or that sermon that we have written and put it into a set of notes that we're going to be taking into the pulpit and preaching from. So we're going to now move to a conversation about manuscripts, outlines, and notes in the pulpit. And when it comes to notes, there are as many methods as there are preachers, I believe. And I want to say from the outset, it has not been my purpose to change anyone's method. However, I am very fond of sharing my method with others, because it seems like when I post pictures of my notes, and if that sounds like it's a bit of hubris, I hope it's not. I post my notes because I do have a very strange way of producing my own pulpit notes, and I find that it's become somewhat helpful for other people. They look almost like NFL coaching play sheets, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But I just want to say, as I'm talking through this, it's not my purpose to change anyone else's mind, because ultimately you as the preacher, you as the communicator, have to do what you believe is best for your personality type, as far as how you relay what you have studied in the sermon that you have produced by the Spirit of God and by the intellect that he's put within you. You have to do what works best for you in that. Did I lose you? Did I lose?
I think I'm here. Are you here?
Okay. Yeah. For some reason it brought me back out, but I'll keep going. All right.
Yep. You're good.
So, as I said, it's not my purpose to change anyone's method, but I want to recommend this. I think we should always be refining our methods. And I am personally not a fan of manuscripts. But again, I'm telling you only my preference on this, because I don't prefer to feel like someone is simply reading to me. I feel like I feel better when I'm the person in the congregation and I'm listening. I feel like communication is more than just simply reading off of a piece of paper. And again, I can't tell you not to use a manuscript. If a manuscript works best for you and that's the way you found best to communicate, that's great. But I will refer again to the late Dr. R.C. Sproul. He was very forceful. I sat in a preaching conference with him about 20 years ago. And in that conference, he basically said, don't use notes at all. You should never use notes. Don't use them. And we were like, not even an outline? Don't even use an outline. And I know this is not a great name to bring up, but Steve Lawson was sitting next to him. And he said to Steve Lawson, because Lawson was one of his students, he said, I want to take Steve's notes away from him and just make him preach. He said, I think he would be better if he didn't have those notes. And so he was much more forceful in his advocacy for preaching without notes. And if you've ever seen him teach, if you've ever seen him preach, he normally has just his Bible and maybe a small note card. And one time we asked him, well, what was on the note card? And he said, normally if it's a date, he doesn't want to forget. He'll write it on the note card so that he has it, but not much more than that. Very few of us have the intellect of the late Dr. Sproul. So I'm not saying we all should try to do what he did, but his argument for preaching with as few notes as possible was that preaching, again, is communication. And when we have this barrier between us, which is basically a manuscript, which is it's an article that we've written or a something that we're reading to the congregation, it creates, at least from his perspective, it creates a disconnect. So is that hard and fast for everybody? No, there are some men who can be very dynamic and use a manuscript, but for me, I'm not one of them. So when it comes to this, again, it's very personal. It's going to be very individual. Here's a thought from Alistair Begg, just to throw out something that he wrote. He said his 5 steps in preparing a sermon are to think himself empty, to read himself full, to write himself clear, to pray himself hot, and then to be himself, and to not preach himself. I always thought that was very good. And the reason why I bring this out in this conversation about manuscripts is because he does use the phrase, he says, to write himself clear. Even though I'm saying I'm not a fan of manuscripts, I'm not saying that you shouldn't write down what you want to say. But here's a very good thing that I think could be done. If you write down what you want to say in your sermon and you write it very clearly, this is what I want to convey, but then have a way to transfer that into a set of notes that doesn't require reading the entire thing. That's my preferred method, to write yourself clearly and then convert that into something that is much simpler. And that's what I've done with my system. Is it's a 1-page explanation of what I have written when I've sat down and considered this text. And I think that's a useful sort of tip, is you can write out your sermon, write out every word. In fact, another thing that you can do, and I often do this, is I'll read it into my audio recorder and I'll listen to it. I'll listen to myself reading what I wrote. And it's something that just sticks with me when I've not only looked at it, but I've heard it. And now it's become part of my mental process. Now when I'm saying it, it's natural and it's communicating. Mm-hmm. Here's a couple of practical tips that have helped me. Number 1, learn how to glance and not read. Mm-hmm. What does that mean? When you're looking at your notes, learn how to glance, get what you want to say and say it without having to sit and look at it and stare at it. And again, make your notes work for you. Don't feel like you're writing for anyone else. No one is there to grade your notes. They're grading. And again, what I'm about to say may come across wrong when I say they're grading you. When they're listening to you, they're not grading your notes. They're grading your communication. And by grading, what I mean is they're either going to benefit or not benefit from the way you convey what you're saying. So what's on the paper doesn't matter to them. What matters is what comes out of your mouth. And so if what's on the paper isn't adequately helping you get it out of your mouth, then figure out a different way to make the paper work for you. Your notes are going to be based on your construction method. Even if you're writing a manuscript, you need to have a clear picture of the whole message before you begin writing. And this is something else I'm going to talk about this more a little bit later when we talk about the conclusion of the sermon, because I'm going to be doing that part. But when I write a sermon, it's like a house. It basically is a diagram. I want to sit down and I want to write out my notes like I was creating house plans. And this way, when I'm preaching through the sermon, I'm literally walking through the house. And this is another part of how it helps me with my memorization of what I'm going to say. My introduction and my conclusion is the front and back porch of my house. The introduction is what brings me in. The back porch is what brings me out. The main thesis, the main idea of the text is the foundation, and that's what I'm going to build my house on. The subpoints are the support of the main point, and they explain the main point. Those are the rooms of the house. This not only helps with my sermon structure, but it also helps me remember that when I go into this room, I need to talk about what's in this room, and I need to stay in that room until I'm done talking about it. And then I need to go to the next room and talk about what's in there. Now, those rooms need to have a connection, like Matthew was talking about. They don't need to be 3 disconnected rooms, but they need to be, I need to go into this room, talk about what's in that room, and then go into the other room and talk about what's in that room. And how do I get between them? The hallways, and the hallways are my transitions. So when I think about building my sermon, I think about building a house. I think about creating a diagram that's very much like blueprints for a house. And so when you are creating your sermon notes, however your brain works, apparently my brain works in pictures. That's the way I think. I think in pictures. I think in diagrams. I think in charts. So I create my sermon notes to look like charts, to look like diagrams, because that's what's going to help me be a better communicator. If you can be a great communicator with a manuscript, great. But if your manuscript is an albatross around your neck, if your manuscript is an anchor that's holding you down and keeping you from communicating, then my recommendation is refine your method and make yourself better through that refining process. I'll mention one other person and then I'll kick it back over to Matthew. H.B. Charles happens to live in my town. H.B. Charles is a wonderful preacher and expositor. And I remember talking to him about preaching one time, and he said he takes a 1 3x5 card into the pulpit with him. 1 3x5 card. Usually he said it just has his outline on it just to keep him tied to that post to where he wants to make sure he doesn't leave. That's what works for him. That may not work for you, but you need to find out what works for you and what helps you to be a better communicator. So I'm going to kick it back over to Matthew now. What are your thoughts on manuscripts?
Well, that's a great question, Keith. And I think you and I are not so terribly far off, although yours have a lot more color than mine. I've seen some of your manuscripts online. Mine have a lot of color too, as I use a lot of color to try to grab my attention. I loved what you said about learn how to refer, but not to read, or how to glance, but not to read. That's a brilliant point, and I think that's a pro move for sure. Now, just me personally, I tend to be a slow verbal processor. I'm actually not very quick on my feet, which is why I could never be a lawyer. I just wouldn't be able to do that kind of quick interchange. It takes me a while to think through concepts. And so I'm a better writer than I am a off-the-cuff speaker. So I actually do manuscript entirely as it relates to the preparation for the sermon. But then my delivery is far more fluid, where I barely look at my manuscript at all. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how to do that here in just a few moments. But I love the way that you described your preparation as like a house, and you have kind of a visual mnemonic device there about how to get through it. I do similar things as well. So let me just quickly share a little bit about my process, and I'm just going to go straight into my next unit, which is going to be preparing to deliver the sermon to the congregation. Okay. So I do write out an entire manuscript, and here's what I do, Keith, as I write my manuscript on 3 pages every single time, 3 full pages, one side, 3 pages. And basically what that does is it monitors the length of the sermon, because it always ends up to be about 41, 42 minutes long. So there's some consistency there. There's some visual cues as to where I am in the sermon. So if I'm in the middle of page 2, I know I'm about halfway home. And the manuscript helps me to regulate my pace and my content. Now, I will say this, and I totally agree with you, Keith. I think you'll agree with this as well. There are 2 kinds of really terrible sermons. I mean, absolutely abominable homiletical disasters. The first is the guy that reads his manuscript to you. I cannot stand that. I might as well just read an essay or have an audible book read to me if that's what we're going to do. I really do not prefer the kind of exposition where a person just simply reads their manuscript, even if it's a very well-written manuscript. I find that delivery to be entirely boring. The exact opposite is also true. I cannot stand the person who extemporaneously is wandering all over the place. They have no idea where they're going, and you have no idea where they're going either, because who knows where the sermon is going to end up. Those are the 2 worst kinds of sermons. So try to meet in the middle with a lot of preparation and then some really good forceful delivery. So here's a few thoughts about that. First, if you are a very sparse outliner, let's say that you are just that note card guy, or you bring a sticky note into the pulpit with you in your Bible, please at least do everybody the favor of having done sufficient research before you come to that moment. Do not trust yourself that you're going to think of all of these brilliant thoughts in the moment, because probably you're not. Probably the best thinking and praying is actually going to be done in the study. So regardless of whether or not you bring an outline, a sticky note, or a full manuscript, please do your congregation the favor of actually working through all the difficulties of the text. So that would be the first thing that I would say. Second, if you are going to be like me and bring a full manuscript into the pulpit with you, again, please do your congregation the favor and the honor of having worked through your own manuscript so that you can deliver it rather forcefully and naturally, rather than being tied very unnaturally to your manuscript. So this is a couple of things that I do, Keith. I love the fact that you even record your sermon so you can listen to it, because there is something oral or aural, A-U-R-A-L, about listening to things that helps us to memorize it in various ways. Now, I tend to be a very visual memorizer. And so as I'm taking my 3 sheets of my manuscript, I'm very visually placing each paragraph conceptually as a thought unit rather than a series of sentences that I want to memorize. So in order to memorize my manuscript, which I try to do entirely, memorize the entire manuscript, which I know it sounds daunting, but it's really not. Instead of trying to memorize line for line or sentence by sentence or even word for word, I memorize concept by concept by concept. Every sermon has an introduction. You can easily memorize your own introduction. If you can't do that, then you really probably need to work on natural delivery. After the introduction is going to be your transition. After that is going to be the context. After that's my thesis statement. And off we run into the 3 main points and their applications and illustrations. Because I've preached enough sermons, my sermons have a natural flow to them, and I know where each thing is basically going to land on the page that I have in front of me. So again, Keith's point